This is the Exposure Brief, a weekly dispatch from Swift Signal Digital for AI native founders navigating the 2026 resilience landscape. I'm your host. Every week, we deconstruct the gap between automation claims and regulatory reality. On today's briefing, our analysts dive into the latest FSC mandates and the tactical shift toward outcome-based governance. Let's head into the lab.
Usually when we talk about diagnosing a really complex problem, especially in something like engineering or, medicine, there is this baseline expectation of precision.
Right, yeah. It's supposed to be clear-cut.
Exactly. Like, if you break your arm, you go to the hospital, they do an x-ray, and you see that jagged white line on the screen, the doctor just points to it and says, there it is. That's the problem. It's totally definitive.
It's binary.
Okay.
I mean, you have a fractured radius or you don't. We naturally gravitate toward that kind of clarity because, well, it makes the path forward obvious. You put a cast on it, you wait 6 weeks, and you move on.
Yeah. But then you step into the actual reality of building enterprise software in March 2026, and suddenly it feels like someone took a sledgehammer to that x-ray machine.
That is unfortunately accurate.
We are looking at a regulatory and technical landscape right now that is, quite honestly, a masterclass in obfuscation. If you are a SaaS founder or a product leader or an enterprise strategist listening to this deep dive right now, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Oh, they definitely do. They're living it.
You are currently watching the federal government and various state governments play this massive high-stakes game of chicken over artificial intelligence regulation. And your product roadmap, it is stuck directly in the crossfire.
Which is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. And the stakes couldn't be higher here. If you guess wrong on how to build your software architecture today, based on a misreading of this landscape.
Which is super easy to do.
So easy. You might literally not have a legally viable business by the end of the year.
So that is our mission for this deep dive today. We are going to unpack a concept that we have been calling the preemption trap.
It's a great name for a terrible suggestion.
Right. We are going to explore why sitting on your hands and, waiting for the federal government to swoop in and solve this chaotic 50-state patchwork of AI laws is a fatal business error. We have a massive stack of sources today.
I really do. It's dense.
We're pulling from deep legal analysis from Latham and Watkins, transcripts from Lawfare, the actual legislative text of Colorado's SB 24-205, highly dense technical specifications from the C2PA consortium, and some really sharp strategic insights from enterprise leaders over at Box.
And we're going to filter all of this information through two distinct analytical lenses to give you a complete picture. You will be taking the role of the strategic optimist today.
I always prefer to find the silver lining.
Which we need. You'll be focusing on the operational opportunity hidden in all this chaos. Specifically, how concepts like modular compliance and treating regulation as a product feature can actually allow for faster innovation, smoother enterprise procurement, and incredible market agility.
Yeah, because the alternative is just paralyzing dread. And you, naturally, will be our compliance pragmatist.
Somebody has to be.
You are going to be delivering the necessary reality checks. You'll be walking us through the terrifying operational reality of the litigation gap, diving into the heavy technical weeds of the EU's Article 50 watermarking requirements, and explaining why the UK's shifting data licensing landscape is about to completely upend the economics of how we build AI.
Someone has to read the fine print.
Yeah.
And right now, the fine print is rewriting the entire tech industry.
Totally. Now, before we really jump into the mechanics of this, there's a crucial context setting we need to do for you, the listener. To fully understand this landscape and why it is so fragmented, we have to look at some intensely polarizing political moves happening right now in real time.
It's unavoidable.
Right.
Yeah.
We're going to be discussing aggressive executive orders coming from the Trump administration, fierce legislative pushback from left-wing state governments, and deep fracturing internal divides among right-wing factions.
And we should be clear about our stance here.
Yes, absolutely. Our goal today is absolutely not to take a side on the politics of this. We are impartially reporting the legal and technical facts derived strictly from our source material. We are not endorsing any political viewpoint. We are just reading the raw technical and legal reality to figure out what this actually means for your engineering and business strategy.
That neutrality is vital because the thesis we are arriving at today doesn't care who you voted for. It is a pure operational reality. In 2026, if you aren't compliant by design at the architectural level, you simply aren't ready for enterprise sales. Period.
Let's start by looking at the macro legal landscape, because you really cannot design your software architecture without knowing the legal reality of the ground you're building on. And right now, there is this massive, comforting illusion floating around Silicon Valley and Austin. We're calling it the federal mirage.
It is an incredibly dangerous mirage for SaaS founders to buy into, mostly because, well, it sounds so logical on the surface.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's set the stage. On December 11, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order titled Ensuring a National Policy Framework for Artificial Intelligence.
Catchy title.
Right. The explicit stated goal of this EO is to establish a minimally burdensome national standard. The underlying philosophy from the administration is very clear. They want to achieve absolute global AI dominance, maintaining a compute and developmental advantage over China.
And they firmly believe that a 50-state patchwork of conflicting, highly specific AI regulations is going to stifle innovation. They think it'll drain startup capital into legal compliance and basically hand that global advantage to other nations.
That makes sense from a macroeconomic perspective.
It does.
Yeah.
That is the stated macroeconomic policy goal. But an executive order is just a piece of paper, unless it has enforcement mechanisms. And this EO tries to manifest that goal using a couple of very heavy, very blunt hammers.
What's the first hammer?
First, it directed the Department of Justice to establish a dedicated AI litigation task force. That task force was officially stood up on January 9, 2026. It stated, explicit purpose is to aggressively challenge state AI laws in federal court, effectively trying to sue these state laws out of existence.
Wow, okay, and the administration didn't stop with just the threat of federal lawsuits, right? They are also using the power of the purse to force compliance.
Oh, absolutely.
The EO targets states that enact or enforce what the Commerce Department deems to be onerous AI laws. The threat is that these states could lose access to massive amounts of federal funding. Specifically, they are threatening to withhold BEAD funding.
BEAD meaning broadband equity, access, and deployment.
Right, and we are not talking about a small grant program here. We are talking about an estimated $21 billion in non-deployment funds.
$21 billion. And it is critical to understand what those specific funds actually pay for. This isn't the money used for physically laying the fiber optic cables in rural areas.
Oh, it's not?
No, it's the funds used for the supporting activities around broadband infrastructure. So the state-level planning, the administration of the networks, digital literacy programs, and massive data mapping projects. It is literally the connective tissue of a state's digital economy.
So it's essential money.
Entirely essential.
Yeah.
Threatening to withhold $21 billion of that is a massive, unprecedented financial lever to pull against state governors.
So if I am a tech founder and I see the President of the United States unleash the DOJ to systematically sue states while simultaneously threatening to withhold $21 billion from them if they dare to regulate my AI product, well, it feels like the cavalry has arrived.
It feels like you're saved.
Exactly. If the DOJ is acting like a massive federal umbrella, isn't it safe for startup to just stand under it and ignore the noise coming from the states? It feels like waiting for the fire department while your house is on fire. Why would I spend my limited runway buying my own complex compliance extinguisher if the federal fire trucks are already on the way with sirens blaring?
I like the fire truck metaphor, but we need to adjust the timeline to match legal reality. Yes, the federal fire trucks are on the way, but they're going to take roughly 3 years to get to your house. And your business is going to burn to the ground in 3 weeks.
3 weeks.
This temporal mismatch is what we call the litigation gap.
Let's really drill down into that.
Yeah.
Why does it take so long? The president gave an order. The DOJ task force is active. Why isn't this an immediate fix?
Because an executive order, no matter how aggressively worded, does not possess a magic constitutional wand that instantly invalidates a duly enacted state law. The EO directs a highly sequenced, bureaucratic, and judicial process.
And there's red tape.
Endless red tape. First, the Commerce Department has to systematically evaluate all the state laws and officially categorize which ones meet the definition of onerous. Then they had to formally refer those specific laws to the DOJ task force. Then the DOJ lawyers have to draft and actually file a lawsuit in a federal district court.
Right.
But here is the critical part. Merely filing a lawsuit doesn't stop the state law from operating.
The state law stays active until a judge says otherwise.
Exactly. The DOJ has to win an injunction. They have to convince a federal judge to proactively put the state law on hold while the underlying merits of the case are argued over the next several years.
Which isn't easy, right?
Securing an injunction is a notoriously high legal bar. It takes months just to get a hearing. The rulings are subject to immediate and endless appeals to higher circuit courts, and there's absolutely no guarantee the DOJ will even win. Meanwhile, these state laws, like the incredibly aggressive ones in California, Texas, and Colorado, are already codified on the books.
And the state attorneys general in those states are not just sitting around waiting to see how the federal court cases play out.
Not at all.
Yeah.
While the DOJ is busy drafting appellate briefs in Washington, D.C., a state AG in Denver or Sacramento can shut your SaaS platform down or hit you with devastating fines for unfair trade practices tomorrow morning. Yes. And these aren't minor cost of doing business fines. Under Colorado law, for example, we are talking about penalties that can hit $53,088 per violation.
Wait, per violation, meaning every single time the AI makes a decision.
Yes. If your enterprise AI model makes 10,000 automated non-compliant decisions in a single afternoon, say, filtering resumes or approving microloans, you're instantly bankrupt.
That's terrorism.
The litigation gap is that terrifying unprotected space between the federal government's long-term promise to protect you and the state government's immediate statutory power to destroy you.
That reframes the entire strategic picture. The umbrella is made of paper. It looks great until the actual storm hits.
Precisely.
But I do want to look at the actual weapons the DOJ is bringing to this fight because, according to the lawfare analysis we reviewed, the legal theories the federal government is floating are fascinating, and they tell us a lot about the future of tech regulation. They highlighted 4 primary legal theories the DOJ might use to attack these state laws. Let's walk through them. How are they trying to tear these state laws down?
The first, and arguably the most traditional, is the Dormant Commerce Clause. This is a constitutional doctrine that essentially says states cannot pass laws that unduly burden interstate commerce. It is designed to prevent a balkanized national economy.
How does that apply to a SaaS product, though?
Think about the physical architecture of AI. It relies on hyperscale data centers in Virginia, compute power distributed across server farms in Ohio, and user endpoints in all 50 states.
It's everywhere.
Right. The DOJ's argument is that if a single state, let's say Colorado, passes a law dictating how an AI model must be trained, they are impermissibly regulating conduct that occurs far beyond their physical borders. This is known as extraterritoriality. The federal argument is that one state should not be allowed to dictate the core engineering architecture of the global internet.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense from an engineering perspective. You really can't partition an LLM at the state line. What is the second legal theory?
The second one is where things get historically bizarre. It relies on a deeply obscure constitutional provision called the Guarantee Clause. Article 4, Section 4 of the Constitution guarantees every state in the Union a Republican form of government.
And just to be clear for the listeners, we are talking about small mailer Republican, meaning a representative democracy, not the political party.
Precisely. Historically, this clause was used during post-Civil War Reconstruction to ensure states didn't revert to monarchies or dictatorships. It is almost never invoked in modern commercial litigation.
So why bring it up now?
Because the core philosophical tenet of a Republican form of government is the consent of the governed. You consent to the laws that govern your life by electing the local officials who write those laws.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. If a tech company builds a monolithic AI model and Colorado passes a law forcing them to alter how that model behaves.
Yes. Because a tech company cannot practically build 50 different versions of their foundational model, they will naturally alter the national model to comply with the strictest state law.
Right, they'll just default to Colorado's rules for everyone.
Exactly. The DOJ's argument under the Guarantee Clause is that a citizen in Florida or Montana is suddenly having their digital life governed by an AI architecture dictated by legislators in Colorado, legislators they never voted for and literally cannot vote out of office. Therefore, the Colorado law is depriving citizens in other states of the Republican form of government.
Wow. That is a staggering legal theory to dust off for software regulation. It shows just how desperate the search for a federal override has become. All right, what's the third theory?
The third theory is much more familiar territory, the First Amendment.
Ah, free speech.
This is perhaps the most heavily contested battleground. The Trump executive order specifically targets state laws that, quote, require AI models to alter their truthful outputs, or that force developers to publicly disclose detailed safety and alignment plans. The legal debate here centers on the difference between compelled speech and commercial disclosure.
Let's break that down. Compelled speech is generally unconstitutional. The government cannot force you to say something you don't want to say or force you to adopt a specific political viewpoint. But commercial disclosure happens all the time.
Exactly. Think of a nutrition label on a box of cereal.
Okay.
The cereal manufacturer might not want to disclose exactly how much high fructose corn syrup is in their product because it might hurt sales. But the government has a compelling interest in public health, so they can legally force that factual disclosure.
So the battle over AI is, what exactly is an AI safety plan? Like, is a state forcing an AI to mitigate bias and output perfectly balanced demographic results a form of unconstitutional compelled political speech? Or is an AI safety plan just a digital nutrition label, a factual disclosure of how the software operates, which is perfectly legal for a state to mandate to protect consumers?
That is exactly the question federal appellate judges will be agonizing over for the next 5 years.
It's a massive gray area. And finally, the fourth theory.
The fourth rests on the administrative power of the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC. The executive order directs the FTC to issue a formal policy statement categorizing state-mandated algorithmic alterations as deceptive acts under Section 5 of the FTC Act.
Walk me through the logic there. How does a state law actually create a deceptive act?
The administration's theory is that an AI model is essentially a mathematical reflection of its training data.
Right.
If a state law forces an AI company to artificially adjust the weights of its algorithm to meet a specific diversity quota, or to suppress certain outputs to comply with a state's definition of safety, that output is no longer a mathematically truthful reflection of the prompt.
So it's essentially lying to the user.
According to this theory, yes. Therefore, the output becomes inherently deceptive to the end consumer. And since the FTC has broad authority to police deceptive trade practices nationally, the federal FTC rules should preempt the state law that is causing the deception.
But the law firm experts were highly skeptical of this approach, right? They noted that this assumes the FTC has the broad, unchecked authority to preempt deeply established state-level consumer protection laws, which is a highly untested and really aggressive expansion of agency power.
It is incredibly aggressive. And what's vital for SaaS strategists to understand is that this aggressive push for federal preemption is not universally supported, even within the political right. You cannot assume that because there is a unified Republican administration, there is a unified strategy on AI. Our sources highlight a massive, fundamental, internal political schism.
This is a crucial dynamic to map out because it completely dictates how this will play out in Congress, where actual permanent laws would need to be passed to fix this.
Right.
On one side of the schism, you have what we can call the Silicon Valley wing of the administration. This faction is heavily pushing for rapid deregulation. They view AI not as a risk to be managed, but as an engine for unprecedented economic abundance. Their primary geopolitical concern is that the U.S. must maintain its compute and developmental advantage over China at all costs.
And how do they view state-level regulation?
They view it as a toxic, bureaucratic nightmare. They argue that a patchwork of 50 different state compliance frameworks only benefits the massive, incumbent tech monopolies, the trillion-dollar companies who already have armies of compliance lawyers and lobbyists on retainer. To the Silicon Valley wing, state laws act as a massive moat that kills early-stage startup competition.
That is a coherent economic argument. But then you look at the other side of the aisle, the populist wing, and they view the Silicon Valley faction with intense suspicion. They are deeply skeptical of big tech consolidating more power. They are intensely concerned about massive white-collar job displacement, and they have rallied around a framework of concerns that they called the 4 Cs.
You 4 Cs. When I was reviewing the source material, I found this political taxonomy really fascinating because it explains the exact motivations behind the state laws. The 4 Cs stand for censorship, creators, communities, and conservatives protecting conservatives. Let's expand on each of these because these are the pain points your software will be judged against.
Let's start with censorship.
Censorship is the deep-seated fear that a handful of foundational AI models built in San Francisco will be programmed to suppress certain political speech, filter out specific historical events, or control the narrative around topics like COVID-19 or election integrity. They view centralized AI as the ultimate choke point for free expression.
What about creators?
This relates to the raw economics of copyright. It is the fear that AI companies are indiscriminately vacuuming up the lifetime work of authors, musicians, journalists, and visual artists, effectively stealing their intellectual property to train models that will eventually replace those exact same creators.
Then communities.
This is pure economic populism. It's the fear that the productivity gains of AI will be entirely captured by coastal tech hubs, while the resulting job losses will absolutely gut local working-class communities in the Midwest and South. It is the fear of rapid, unmanaged economic dislocation.
And the final C, protecting conservatives.
Yeah.
This often revolves around cultural issues, protecting children from unrestricted algorithmic content, and preventing what they perceive as baked-in ideological bias in how the models are aligned.
What is critical to understand is that this populist wing does not want federal preemption, if that preemption means wiping out the state laws designed to protect those 4 Cs.
They want the states to be able to fight back.
Exactly. They do not trust the federal government or big tech to police themselves. This isn't just theory either. They have already flexed their political muscle. This faction successfully killed a proposed 10-year moratorium on state AI laws that was hidden in a Senate reconciliation bill, and they systematically stripped broad preemption language out of the recent National Defense Authorization Act.
So if we synthesize all of this, the federal mirage is exactly that, a mirage. Yes, the president has issued an order to fight state laws, but the legal theories required to win those fights are completely untested, deeply weird in some cases, and will take years to litigate through the appellate courts. And the political coalition required to bypass the courts and just pass a clean federal preemption law in Congress is completely fractured along ideological lines.
Which brings us right back to the Sauce founder, looking at their product roadmap in March 2026. You cannot wait for this to resolve. You cannot base your engineering strategy on the hope that the DOJ wins a dormant Commerce Clause argument in 2029.
Right, because you won't make it to 2029.
Because while the federal umbrella is made of paper, the state regulatory storm is making landfall right now.
And the biggest, most destructive storm currently making landfall is in Colorado. Because the federal government is paralyzed, we have to look at the actual statutory text of the laws going into effect. And the most comprehensive, legally aggressive AI law in the United States right now is Colorado's SB 24205, officially titled the Consumer Protections for Artificial Intelligence Act. And this isn't some distant future threat. It goes into effect on June 30th, 2026.
Which, if you understand enterprise software development cycles, is practically tomorrow.
Literally.
We need to be excruciatingly clear about the scope and the penalties of this law, because it fundamentally alters how software is sold. This law is not a set of gentle guidelines or best practices. It is a rigid, comprehensive governance framework. It specifically targets what the state defines as high-risk AI systems.
How exactly are they defining high risk? Because, every founder thinks their software is just a helpful tool, not a high-risk liability.
Colorado defines a high-risk AI system as any system that makes, or is a substantial factor in making, a consequential decision. And the statute defines consequential decisions as anything impacting a consumer's access to employment, housing, healthcare, insurance, financial lending, education, or essential government services.
Okay, so we need to translate that into SaaS reality. If your software touches the preliminary approval workflow for a regional bank's mortgage application process, you are high risk.
Yes.
If you build an automated resume filtering tool for a corporate HR department, you are high risk. If you build a co-pilot that helps a doctor summarize patient intake forms, you are high risk.
Absolutely. If your algorithm touches the trajectory of a human life in a meaningful economic or medical way, the state of Colorado considers you high risk. And this is where the legal architecture gets incredibly tricky, because the law imposes massive, distinct legal obligations on 2 different groups, developers and deployers.
Let's clearly separate those. Who is who?
Developers are the entities actually building the foundational model, or substantially modifying an existing one. OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, these are developers. Deployers are the companies actually purchasing and using that AI to make decisions about consumers. The bank using the mortgage software, the hospital using the medical summarizer, they are the deployers.
Yeah. I can hear a lot of lean sauce startup founders listening to this and panicking, thinking, hey, we are a team of 25 people working out of a co-working space. We aren't Google. Surely there is a small business exemption in this massive piece of legislation to protect startups.
Well, there is an exemption written into the text of the law for businesses with under 50 employees. But for a modern AI startup, it is a complete and total illusion. It is a trap.
Why? Walk us through the mechanics of that trap.
because that 50-employee exemption only applies if the small business does not train or fine-tune the AI system with their own proprietary data. If you just take an off-the-shelf, generalized model from an API, plug it into your interface without changing its weights, and use it exactly as provided, you might be exempt from some of the heaviest developer burdens. But ask yourself, what is the entire value proposition of a competitive B2B SaaS company in 2026?
It's the customization. It's using our proprietary industry-specific data to fine-tune the model so it is exponentially smarter for our specific users than a generic chatbot would be.
Exactly. But the exact second you feed your proprietary data into that model to fine-tune it, you are actively shaping its behavior and its decision-making matrix. Under the strict definitions of Colorado law, you have just crossed the threshold from a mere user to a substantial modifier.
So you become a developer.
You are now legally a developer. You instantly lose the small business exemption. You are now fully on the hook for the entire weight of SB 24205's compliance mandates, and you are accountable for the downstream risks of algorithmic discrimination.
Okay, here is where I am going to put on my strategic optimist hat. Because looking at this towering wall of compliance, the $53,000 fines, the strict liability, the complete lack of a viable startup exemption, it is incredibly easy to view this as a massive innovation-killing burden. But I want to introduce a completely different paradigm for our listeners. We need to stop viewing this as a legal blockade and start viewing it as regulation as a product feature.
That is quite a pivot. Explain how a massive legal liability magically transforms into a product feature.
It's all about understanding the psychology of the enterprise buyer. Let's look at the source material we pulled from FairNow, which provides a strategic framework for building AI model cards. Under the Colorado law, developers, which, as we just established, includes any startup fine-tuning a model, are legally required to provide deployers with exhaustive documentation about how the AI works. This includes creating a dynamic model card and a dataset card.
And these cards aren't just marketing brochures. They have to detail the core mathematical architecture of the system, the specific objectives it was trained to optimize for, its performance benchmarks, exactly where the training data was sourced from, and critically, a detailed explanation of how the model was rigorously evaluated for demographic bias.
Right. Now, historically in software sales, compliance documentation is seen as a necessary evil. It's this dense stack of PDFs that you begrudgingly hand over to the client's legal department at the very end of a 9-month sales cycle, usually causing friction and delays.
Everyone hates the legal review phase.
Exactly. But what the FairNow analysis points out is that in 2026, this documentation is no longer just legal CYA. It is a fundamental B2B sales requirement.
Because the deployers are terrified.
Exactly. If you walk into a pitch meeting with the procurement team of a Fortune 500 enterprise, they are acutely aware of Colorado SB 24205. They know that if they buy your software, they become the deployer. They know that if your software discriminates against a customer, the Colorado AG is going to fine them $53,000 per violation. They are paralyzed by liability risk.
So how does the model card solve that for them?
If you, as the SaaS vendor, walk into that pitch and say, we understand your regulatory exposure. We have already built a comprehensive, dynamically updating model card. We have mathematically mapped the data lineage. We have thoroughly documented our bias evaluations. We are handing you a turnkey compliance artifact. You completely change the dynamic of the sale.
That's a powerful pitch.
You aren't just selling a workflow efficiency tool anymore. You're selling legal peace of mind. Your proactive compliance is the feature that accelerates the enterprise procurement cycle. You win the massive enterprise deal not because your UI is slightly better, but because you make it legally safe for the enterprise to buy you.
I will concede that is a highly strategic way to look at the market opportunity. If you can commoditize compliance, you have a massive moat. But as the pragmatist, I cannot let us downplay the grueling operational reality of what providing that peace of mind actually requires. Let's break down the exact granular requirements deployers face under Colorado law, because that is the pain point your SaaS product has to miraculously solve for them.
Fair enough. Lay it out for us. What does a deployer actually have to do to stay legal?
First, they are legally mandated to conduct formal, repeatable impact assessments, and this is no one-and-done questionnaire. These assessments must be completed prior to deploying the AI, they must be refreshed annually, and critically, they must be redone within 90 days of any substantial modification to the system.
And in the era of continuous CI/CD pipelines and constantly updating models, a substantial modification could happen every quarter. What actually goes into an impact assessment?
It's essentially a comprehensive corporate audit. They have to document the specific categories of data processed by the AI, outline the exact transparency measures taken to inform consumers, and provide a concrete technical plan for post-deployment monitoring.
That sounds exhausting.
It gets worse. Colorado law mandates that this entire internal risk management program cannot just be a policy typed up on a Google Doc. It must structurally align with internationally recognized frameworks, specifically the NIST AI Risk Management Framework, or ISO/IE 42001.
So you have to map your startup's internal engineering processes to the same rigorous international standards used by defense contractors and global banks. That is a massive operational lift.
Correct. And that is just the internal compliance. Then there are the external consumer-facing requirements. Deployers must provide clear, plain language notices to consumers before an AI system makes a consequential decision about them. They must provide clear opt-out options for automated profiling.
Which means building entirely new user flows.
Yes. And crucially, they must offer a dedicated avenue for a human review or appeal of any adverse decision made by the AI. If the AI denies the loan, the consumer has the statutory right to demand a human loan officer review the exact logic of that denial.
Okay, I have a math strategic question about this because it touches on user experience.
Uh,
If we have to design an interface that discloses all of these known limitations, openly admits the risks of demographic bias, and constantly flags the fact that a machine is making the decision, don't we risk completely scaring off our end users? How do we balance this aggressive statutory demand for radical transparency with maintaining the user's confidence in the product's competence?
It is a valid concern, but I think it fundamentally misunderstands consumer psychology. It is the exact same psychological shift we saw in the 1990s with the mandatory introduction of standardized nutrition labels on packaged food.
Oh, that's an interesting comparison.
Initially, food manufacturers fought it tooth and nail. They were terrified that if people actually saw the massive sugar content or the list of unpronounceable artificial preservatives, they would instantly stop buying the product.
But the exact opposite happened. The label normalized the ingredients.
Exactly. The label itself became a universal proxy for baseline trust. Consumers intuitively realized that a company willing to be highly transparent about its ingredients was inherently more trustworthy than a company trying to hide them in a black box.
I see.
In the enterprise AI space, openly admitting the statistical limitations of your model doesn't destroy trust. It establishes deep technical competence. It signals to the enterprise buyer that you actually understand the mathematical bounds of your own technology, rather than just selling them a magic, infallible black box that will eventually explode in their face.
Which brings us to a massive fundamental logistical hurdle. Once you, as a founder, commit to this level of radical transparency, once you agree to tell the enterprise buyer and the consumer exactly how the AI works and exactly where the training data came from, how do you actually execute that technically?
That's the billion-dollar question.
Right. We are talking about billions of parameters and terabytes of scraped data. How do you mathematically, irrefutably prove where a piece of digital content came from?
And that transition moves us perfectly from legal theory into the harsh reality of software engineering. Because radical transparency is just an elegant philosophy until you actually have to write the code to enforce it. And to understand the code that is going to govern provenance in 2026, we have to look across the Atlantic to the European Union.
Because, as usual, the EU is acting as the primary regulatory vanguard, and their laws are already shaping global technical standards by sheer market gravity.
Specifically, we need to look at Article 50 of the sweeping EU AI Act. This specific article explicitly requires the affirmative marking and labeling of all AI-generated content.
Yeah.
You simply cannot output a synthetic video, a generated image, or a piece of automated text in the European market without technically flagging it as machine-generated.
No exception.
None. And the European Commission recently published a highly detailed, updated code of practice dictating exactly how software companies are expected to achieve this technical feat.
I dug into that code of practice. What is the core technical architecture they are demanding?
The Commission emphasizes a mandatory two-layered marking approach. They are trying to balance robust technical security with reducing the processing overhead and compliance burden on developers. The two mandatory layers are secured, cryptographic metadata, and perceptual watermarking.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the actual engineering engine powering this two-layered approach isn't some proprietary, clunky government software built by bureaucrats in Brussels. It is an open, global standard being furiously developed and driven by a massive industry consortium called the C2PA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity.
And we have extensive, deeply technical transcripts from a recent streaming media panel that breaks down exactly how the C2PA architecture functions at the packet level.
But before you drag us down into the deep technical weeds of cryptography, we need to clarify a fundamental philosophical point about what C2PA actually is, by clarifying what it is not. C2PA is fundamentally not DRM.
Digital rights management, the technology the music and film industry used to lock down MP3s and DVDs in the early 2000s.
Right. DRM is inherently designed to lock content down and restrict user behavior. If you slap DRM on a movie file, you are stopping the creative process cold. The user can't remix it, they can't edit it in Premiere, they can't even take a simple screenshot of it. It is a locked, encrypted vault.
It's extremely restrictive.
C2PA operates on a completely inverted philosophy. It does not stop you from interacting with or modifying an image or a video. Instead, it meticulously tracks the creative chain of custody.
It operates as an irrefutable cryptographic audit trail traveling alongside the file.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I can take a raw photograph on my phone, legally sign it with my C2PA credentials, and post it online. You can download that exact photo, aggressively crop it, run a massive AI stylistic filter over it, and post it again. C2PA doesn't block you from doing any of that.
Okay, so it just tracks it.
But as long as the editing software you use is C2PA compliant, the metadata embedded in the file will automatically update to say, original raw photo captured by host, aggressively cropped and heavily AI filtered by expert. The underlying content can be endlessly remixed, memed, and altered, but the provenance, the mathematical truth of its origin and journey, travels with it permanently.
Which is absolutely vital for compliance with both the EU's Article 50 and the Colorado transparency requirements we just discussed. But the engineering question remains, how does that provenance actually travel?
Right, how does it stick?
How do we securely bind that fragile text metadata to the actual pixels or audio waves of the file so a bad actor can't just delete it? The latest C2PA specifications, specifically version 2.3, outline two primary, highly complex methods, hard bindings and soft bindings. Let's start by unpacking hard bindings.
A hard binding sounds robust and permanent. How does it physically work within the file architecture?
A hard binding relies heavily on cryptographic hashes, typically using an advanced algorithm like SHA-256. Essentially, the software takes the core digital asset, the raw image or video data, runs it through an incredibly complex one-way mathematical formula, and generates a unique fixed-length string of characters. Think of it as a unique digital fingerprint.
Okay, got it.
That hash is then securely embedded into the asset's attached C2PA manifest. If even a single microscopic pixel of that image is altered by a malicious actor trying to manipulate the file, the underlying math changes. The new hash won't match the manifesto's hash, and the system immediately flags that the asset has been tampered with and the provenance is broken.
That sounds foolproof for a static image like a JPEG. But wait, modern video files are notoriously complex and fluid. You can't just hash a massive 4K streaming video file the exact same way you hash a static JPEG, right? The data is constantly moving.
You're exactly right to spot that flaw, and the engineers behind the C2PA specs had to build a complex workaround for this, particularly for ISO-BMFF files.
Translate ISO-BMFF for us.
It stands for ISO Base Media File Format. It is the underlying architectural structure used by MP4s and almost all common streaming video types. ISO-BMFF files do not store data as one giant block. They use a highly compartmentalized box structure.
Boxes, okay.
Some of these internal boxes contain the actual immutable audio and video data, but other boxes contain dynamic streaming metadata or network packet information that changes constantly as the video buffers on a mobile network, adapts to a user's bandwidth, or changes resolution midstream.
Ah, I see the problem. If you run a cryptographic hash over the entire MP4 file, the hash will break the second someone streams it on a slow 5G connection because the buffering metadata changed, even though the actual visual video hasn't been maliciously altered at all.
Precisely. To solve this streaming nightmare, C2PA engineering uses what are called exclusion lists. When creating the hard binding hash for a video file, the system explicitly lists the specific structural boxes within the MP4 that are legally allowed to change without breaking the cryptographic hash.
That's clever.
But the golden rule for developers implementing this is simple but critical. Never add a box to the exclusion list if modifying that box could in any way alter the actual audiovisual presentation the human user sees.
So the core visual truth of the video is mathematically locked down by the hash, but the network delivery mechanisms can still fluctuate and function normally. That is a brilliant piece of engineering.
It really is.
But it brings me to my next massive concern. What happens when that perfectly hashed, beautifully documented, C2PA-compliant video hits a massive social media platform that simply doesn't care about C2PA standards? What happens when Twitter or Meta automatically strips all the attached metadata to save file size and server costs?
You have just identified the catastrophic Achilles heel of hard bindings. If the metadata is stripped by a platform's compression algorithm, the hard binding is instantly destroyed.
Poof, gone.
The C2PA manifest is permanently decoupled from the visual asset. The audit trail goes dark. And this exact vulnerability is why the EU Code of Practice strictly mandates a second layer of protection and why the C2PA consortium had to develop what they call soft bindings.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly is a soft binding, and how does it survive a social media platform's compression algorithm?
A soft binding is designed to survive the complete stripping of external metadata. These involve highly advanced techniques like invisible cryptographic watermarks or perceptual digital fingerprints embedded directly into the actual visual pixels or audio waves of the content itself.
So it's baked in?
Yes. A human eye cannot see it, and violently compressing the file for a social media feed does not destroy the underlying mathematical pattern embedded in the pixels.
Okay, so the invisible watermark survives, but how does that actually help the end user if the manifest detailing the provenance is gone? A watermark doesn't tell me who made the video.
It does if you understand the broader architecture. The C2PA framework allows for the manifest store, the actual file containing the provenance history, to be kept entirely external, housed in a secure, centralized cloud repository, rather than directly embedded in the video file itself.
Oh, I see.
Right. So if an end user sees a highly suspicious politically charged video on social media that has had all its metadata stripped, their browser plugin or a fact-checking tool can scan the video, detect the surviving invisible soft binding watermark, and use that watermark as a cryptographic key to query the external cloud database.
That's amazing.
The system finds the matching C2PA manifest in the cloud and instantly reconnects the detailed provenance history to the stripped video on the user's screen.
Wait. Let me play devil's advocate here, because anytime you decouple data and rely on external lookups, you introduce massive security vulnerabilities.
Oh, for sure.
If the detailed provenance data is stored in an external cloud repository, and we are relying solely on an invisible watermark key to connect them, what stops a highly sophisticated, state-sponsored, malicious actor from using what the C2PA documentation calls adversarial substitution?
Explain the exact attack vector you are envisioning there.
Okay, say a bad actor downloads a completely legitimate, verified news video of a politician speaking. They strip the original cloud manifest connection. They then create a totally fake, highly convincing C2PA manifest full of lies, saying the video is an AI deepfake created by a rival campaign, and they point their new fake manifest directly at the original surviving watermark key.
Right.
When a fact checker queries that watermark, how does the system know which cloud manifest is telling the truth?
It is a fantastic question, and adversarial substitution is a premier threat vector the consortium had to solve for. The C2PA trust model mathematically accounts for this through the use of rigorous cryptographic timestamps and signed assertions from recognized authorities.
How does that work in practice?
Let's walk through the defense. When the original legitimate journalist captures the video, their initial C2PA manifest is not just created, it is cryptographically signed and permanently timestamped by a trusted, centralized certificate authority at the exact millisecond of creation.
It establishes an absolute timeline.
Yes. So if Bob the bad actor creates a fake manifest 3 days later and tries to bind it to the same watermark, the system will indeed locate both manifests in the cloud. But when the fact-checker software queries the soft binding, the software will instantly compare the cryptographic signatures.
And it sees the real one is older.
It will immediately see that the journalist's manifest possesses an earlier, cryptographically verified, mathematically irrefutable timestamp. The timeline exposes the fraud. The earlier timestamp definitively proves that the alternative provenance trail is a later fabrication.
Wow. That is an incredibly elegant defense. But it also highlights a terrifying operational reality for SaaS founders. To comply with the transparency laws coming online in 2026, you don't just need a savvy legal team reading Colorado statutes. You need a highly sophisticated engineering team capable of orchestrating cryptographic hashes, managing ISO BMFF exclusion lists, and building soft-binding cloud lookup architectures.
We haven't even hit the hardest part yet, because all of that incredibly complex C2PA engineering is just designed to prove what the data is as it exits your system. Which brings us to an even more fundamental existential problem for AI companies. We need to transition our focus from the technical provenance of the data output to the brutal financial reality of accessing the data input. We have to look at the raw materials.
Because before you can cryptographically prove the provenance of your AI's output, you have to actually feed massive amounts of training data into your foundational models. And for the last 5 years, the entire generative AI boom has been fueled by a massive global, legally gray, free-for-all buffet of scraped internet data.
It has been the absolute Wild West era of data mining. AI companies have assumed that if data is publicly visible on a screen, it is free to scrape and train on. But the sheriff is finally arriving in town, and it looks like the first badge is being worn by regulators in the United Kingdom.
Let's dig into this, because the UK is setting a precedent that will immediately impact global API costs. We need to look closely at the December 2025 progress report issued by the UK government. Specifically, this is a highly detailed report mandated under Section 137 of the UK's Data Use and Access Act.
Right.
The Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, working in tandem with the Intellectual Property Office, is currently preparing a massive economy-wide economic impact assessment focused entirely on the intersection of copyright law and artificial intelligence.
They're essentially trying to legislate a solution to the massive economic tension between the creators, the publishers, authors, and news organizations whose work is being ingested, and the tech companies building the models. Yeah. The government report outlines 3 core legislative objectives. First, establishing control for rights holders to seek fair remuneration. Second, maintaining access for AI developers to train models lawfully so the UK tech sector doesn't collapse. And third, enforcing deep transparency in how the copyright framework is applied.
To achieve those 3 highly conflicting objectives, the UK government ran a massive public consultation proposing 3 distinct legislative policy options. Let's walk through each of them in detail, because one of these options is going to dictate the global price of data for the next decade. What is option 1?
Option 1 is the absolute maximalist approach favoring creators. The policy would radically strengthen copyright enforcement, requiring explicit negotiated licensing in almost all cases. This means the complete death of fair use or fair dealing arguments for commercial text and data mining. If an AI company wants to ingest a publisher's website, proprietary database, or a digital library to train their model, they cannot just scrape it. They must sit down and negotiate a bespoke commercial license with the rights holder every single time.
Which, if implemented, would instantly bankrupt almost all smaller AI startups. The transactional friction alone would be insurmountable. It would consolidate AI development power entirely within the mega-cap tech companies, the Apples and Googles of the world, who actually have the balance sheets to write billion-dollar licensing checks to the New York Times and Getty Images. Okay, so that's the creator's dream scenario. What is option 2?
Option 2 is the absolute maximalist approach for the tech industry. This option proposes a broad, blanket data mining exception to copyright law,
which would effectively enshrine the current Wild West scraping practices into permanent protected law. It would give AI companies total legal cover to scrape absolutely anything publicly available on the internet for commercial training, completely regardless of the original creator's copyright claims.
Exactly. Which, unsurprisingly, resulted in a massive coordinated revolt from the creative industries, media conglomerates, and the publishing lobby. The political blowback was severe, so we arrive at option 3, which the December report explicitly states is the UK government's preferred legislative option moving forward.
Option 3 is where the future of our industry lies. Break it down.
Option 3 establishes a default data mining exception, meaning scraping is generally allowed, but it fundamentally alters the power dynamic by allowing rights holders to easily and legally opt out or reserve their rights. And critically, this opt-out system is to be underpinned by robust, legally enforceable supporting measures on transparency.
So practically speaking, the default status is that a tech company can scrape the web, but the creator or publisher can explicitly put up a machine-readable flag, perhaps utilizing a specific C2PA-signed assertion integrated into their site's header that unequivocally states, "Do not train on my data." And if that flag is present, the blanket exception vanishes, and the AI company is legally forced to pay for a commercial license to ingest that specific data.
Exactly. The power of refusal is codified. And while an opt-out system might sound to a casual observer like a reasonable balanced compromise, the pragmatist's cost analysis reveals a very harsh, incoming reality for SaaS founders building on top of AI. Think back to the litigation gap we discussed in Section 1.
Where aggressive state laws take effect immediately while federal challenges drag on for years in court.
Yes, that concept of immediate localized enforcement applies globally to copyright enforcement under this new UK paradigm. If the UK moves forward with option 3 and strictly requires AI developers to respect machine-readable opt-outs and negotiate licenses, the golden era of frictionless, free API scraping is dead.
Because it won't just be a few indie bloggers opting out. Every major publishing conglomerate, every global news organization, every massive stock photo site, and every lucrative data broker is going to instantly exercise their statutory opt-out right.
Precisely. They will throw the opt-out switch across their entire digital empires, demand exorbitant licensing fees for access to their high-quality data, and they will back up those demands with the threat of immediate devastating injunctions under the new UK law. They will shut down model training runs.
Which changes everything.
And the ripple effect of this is what SaaS founders need to model for. You, as a startup founder, won't be able to just casually hit an OpenAI or Anthropic API endpoint and assume the vast ocean of data feeding those foundational models was acquired for free.
The foundational model providers are going to face astronomical recurring licensing bills to maintain the quality of their training sets. And they're not going to absorb those costs. They're going to pass those massive licensing fees directly down the chain to the API consumers.
Which is every single SaaS company building AI-powered features.
If the raw material of AI, high-quality external data suddenly skyrockets in price because these global licensing models become mandatory, it fundamentally alters the unit economics of every AI startup. So if the cost of accessing raw external knowledge goes up exponentially globally, doesn't that logically dictate that a company's internal proprietary data suddenly becomes their most uniquely valuable asset?
It absolutely does. As external data becomes commoditized and fiercely paywalled, your internal corporate data becomes the only asset that you can actually control the financial cost of and fully guarantee the legal provenance of. Your internal data is your ultimate competitive moat.
But, and this is the massive caveat that leads us to the climax of this deep dive, that data is only a moat if you can actually use it. Which brings us to the operational solution. How do we survive this? We need to talk about modular compliance, which I firmly believe is the ultimate 2026 competitive advantage.
Because right now, most legacy enterprises and even mid-stage startups cannot actually use their internal data to power AI. They are sitting on an absolute goldmine of proprietary knowledge. But the gold is thoroughly mixed with highly toxic compliance waste.
What do you mean by toxic waste?
I am referring to the catastrophic unstructured data problem. We reviewed a phenomenal, highly strategic interview from Emerge Artificial Intelligence Research between Daniel Fagella and Aaron Levy, the CEO of Box. In that interview, they point out a frankly staggering statistic from an IDC research report. Over 90% of all enterprise data generated in recent years is entirely unstructured.
Let's define the reality of unstructured data for a moment. We aren't talking about neat, perfectly labeled SQL databases. We are talking about the chaotic digital exhaust of a modern company. Word documents, stray PDFs, 10-year-old email threads, chaotic Slack channels, random financial spreadsheets saved on local desktops.
Exactly. It is highly sensitive information scattered wildly across a deeply fragmented ecosystem of different, disconnected SaaS platforms. And the operational drag of this chaos is measurable. They cited a study from Bar-Ilan University showing that the average knowledge worker wastes more than 10% of their entire week and entire full workday doing nothing but fruitlessly searching for scattered information across these fragmented systems.
Now, wasting 10% of human payroll on search is bad for general productivity, yes. But in the era of generative AI, having unstructured, chaotic data is absolutely catastrophic.
Because think about the architecture. If you take an incredibly powerful large language model and you just plug it directly via API into a fragmented, disorganized swamp of unstructured corporate data where the access permissions are totally chaotic or completely broken, what actually happens when a user types a prompt?
You get massive, highly confident hallucinations. The AI dynamically pulls a redlined, outdated draft of a massive vendor contract instead of the final, legally binding version, and bases its strategic summary on garbage data. Or, much worse, you trigger a massive career-ending compliance breach.
Right, the data leak scenario.
Exactly. The AI seamlessly bypasses broken folder permissions, summarizes the CEO's highly confidential pre-announcement M&A strategy document, and cheerfully serves it up to a junior marketing associate who just innocently asked the chatbot for recent company news.
It is a recipe for disaster. You are feeding disorganized, permissionless data into a system that fundamentally requires strict structure, deep context, and rigid boundaries to be actually intelligent. As Aaron Levy so perfectly put it in the interview, without underlying structural data governance, the LLM isn't being intelligent, it's just taking a highly articulate guess based on whatever files it bumped into first.
So, what does this all mean? How do we synthesize all of this? How does a SaaS founder solve the unstructured data problem, survive the impending UK data licensing cost explosion, manage the incredibly dense C2PA cryptographic technical requirements, and successfully dodge the $53,000 liability traps of Colorado's SB 24205? What is the actual engineering blueprint?
You must fundamentally change how you build software. You have to build a modular architecture. You must ruthlessly decouple your AI model from your foundational data layer.
This is the strategic masterstroke I want every listener to take away today. Do not, under any circumstances, hard-code your core SaaS product to rely exclusively on a single LLM. The webinar we reviewed from Brizzy, featuring Bogdan, their chief product officer, and VTO from Interim, nailed this concept perfectly. They were discussing the strategic difference between trying to build an AI product from scratch versus strategically plugging one in.
The analogy they used was brilliant. Buy the kitchen, build the recipe.
I absolutely love that framework. Let the thousands of PhD engineers at the massive tech firms, the Googles, the Microsofts, the OpenAIs, obsess over the foundational models. Let them spend the billions of dollars figuring out the GPU compute loads, the C2PA compliance, and the massive UK licensing fees. You buy access to their incredibly expensive kitchen via an API, but you build the recipe. You own the specific workflow, the frictionless user interface, and the unique proprietary data value your SaaS provides to the enterprise.
But to make that buy-the-kitchen strategy work safely within an enterprise environment, you need an intermediary. You need intelligent middleware. Specifically, you need a box-style modular middleware solution. You must architect a federated content layer that sits rigidly between your scattered, unstructured data swamp and the interchangeable AI models you are calling.
Let's get technical for a moment. Explain exactly how that federated layer works to solve the compliance nightmare.
The middleware layer acts as the ultimate gatekeeper. It aggressively normalizes all the metadata and, most importantly, the complex user permissions before the AI is ever allowed to touch a single document. It continuously maps out exactly who owns a file, how that file relates chronologically to other files, and critically, what the specific human user making the query is legally and corporately allowed to see.
So it filters the reality for the AI.
Yes. When a junior employee asks the AI a question, the AI doesn't just blindly search the entire company database. It only searches the highly restricted, normalized, permission-aware subset of data dynamically provided to it by the middleware in that exact millisecond.
So the complex access controls, the compliance boundaries, remain flawlessly intact across every single query. Regardless of how powerful the LLM is, the AI is trapped in a safe box.
Exactly. And this architectural decision is exactly how you achieve what we called earlier regulation as a product feature. Because your system architecture fundamentally assumes that everything, the laws, the models, the costs, is going to constantly change.
Let's tie this entire deep dive together with a highly realistic scenario. Imagine you are a SaaS founder and your enterprise client is a deployer under Colorado's SB 24205. You've helped them do their rigorous impact assessments. Everything is running smoothly. But suddenly, on a Tuesday morning, the Colorado Attorney General issues an emergency notice that the specific foundational LLM you have integrated into your software has been found to have a fatal flaw regarding algorithmic discrimination in lending.
If you made the architectural mistake of hard-coding that specific model deeply into the core fabric of your SaaS platform, you are instantly in breach of the law. Your client is facing $53,000 fines per transaction, and your engineering team has to halt all product development and spend the next quarter frantically rewriting your entire software stack from scratch to rip that model out.
Which is a death sentence.
Your business might not survive the quarter.
But if you listen to this deep dive and you built a modular, permission-aware middleware architecture,
It becomes a minor operational update. You simply swap the non-compliant model out, you sever the API connection to the outlawed LLM, and you plug a new, legally compliant LLM into your middleware.
Just like that.
Just like that. The complex user permissions, the rigorous data governance rules, the embedded C2PA tracking signatures, the enterprise access logs, absolutely all of that remains perfectly intact within your federated content layer. You seamlessly adapt your entire platform to the new aggressive state regulation in a single afternoon, rather than losing a quarter of engineering time to a rewrite.
That flexibility is the ultimate 2026 competitive advantage.
It is sheer survival through agility built deeply into the architecture.
Okay, let's bring this home. We have covered an immense, complex amount of ground today. We started by dismantling the comforting illusion of the federal mirage, the idea that a Trump executive order and a DOJ litigation task force could simply wave a wand and preempt aggressive state laws using highly untested constitutional theories like the Dormant Commerce Clause and the Guarantee Clause.
We shattered that mirage with the brutal reality of the litigation gap. We established that while the federal government is tied up in appellate courts for years, state laws like Colorado's SB 24205 are taking effect right now, and they are demanding comprehensive risk management programs, rigorous impact assessments, and consumer appeals processes for any AI system making a consequential decision.
We waded through the dense technical weeds of how to actually execute radical transparency, exploring the EU's Article 50 mandates and the incredibly complex C2PA specifications. We learned how hard bindings utilize cryptographic hashes and ISO BMFF exclusion lists to mathematically lock down streaming video files, and how soft bindings use invisible, perceptual watermarks to securely pull provenance manifests from external cloud databases.
We examined the massive economic shockwaves radiating from the UK's new Data Act, realizing that a global shift toward a statutory opt-out copyright framework is going to abruptly end the era of free API scraping, which means the cost of external data is going to skyrocket, making your internal, proprietary, governed data your absolute most valuable corporate asset.
And finally, we arrived at the strategic solution: modular compliance. We explored the necessity of decoupling the AI from your data using a federated, permission-aware middleware layer. This is how you conquer the unstructured data problem, and more importantly, it is how you turn terrifying legal compliance into a highly lucrative B2B sales accelerator. To win massive enterprise sales in 2026, compliance cannot be a PDF you attach to an email. It must be baked into the fundamental design of your product.
If you aren't compliant by design, you simply aren't ready for enterprise sales.
But before we let you go back to your product roadmaps, we want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought. It is something quietly hidden deep within the technical documentation of the C2PA specification regarding distributed ledger technology.
Section 8 of the C2PA spec specifically. It details an entirely different paradigm for establishing digital truth.
Right. We have spent this entire deep dive talking about the clash between state versus federal control, Colorado regulators versus Washington, D.C. lawyers. We are assuming that a government entity gets to write the laws and a centralized authority gets to mandate what the truth is. But the C2PA specification explicitly allows for the integration of decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs, to manage cryptographic certificate trust lists via immutable smart contracts on a blockchain.
It creates a fully decentralized, algorithmic alternative to relying on centralized, government-backed claim signing services.
So here is the massive question for you to mull over as you architect the future of your company. What happens to enterprise compliance, and what happens to the entire concept of the preemption trap when the ultimate, irrefutable arbiter of digital truth isn't a judge in Washington, D.C., and isn't an attorney general in Colorado, but is instead a decentralized, tokenized mathematical ledger floating globally in the cloud, governed by absolutely no single nation at all?
It is fundamentally a question of where trust actually lives in the digital age. Does it live in a courtroom? Or does it live in the cryptography?
Until next time, keep building.
You've been listening to The Exposure Brief. If today's analysis highlighted a gap in your own product's liability surface area, don't wait for the audit. Head over to theguardrail.beehive.com to join the community and get our weekly audit checklists. And for a private diagnostic of your narrative risk, visit swiftsignaldigital.card.co. Stay secure.